Helping Seniors Television, all about improving quality of life for seniors. If you're a senior, know a senior, or plan to be a senior, then this show is for you. It's all about helping you develop your own aging plan so you can age actively and with dignity. Helping Seniors Television from the Helping Seniors Network of information, education, and resources.
I'm Kerry, Fink, and welcome to this edition of Helping Seniors Television. You know, Helping Seniors is a Brevard County, Florida-based 501c3, which is a fancy word for a nonprofit. We were founded by retired Navy Captain Joe Steckler. We're now many, many years into our operation of helping seniors in Brevard, and we do that by educating and informing and connecting seniors to the resources that will make a difference. One of the things that Joe has always talked about is the importance of making an aging plan. And that sounds a bit like high tech or like big picture, and it can be. But those of us who live in Florida, we understand a hurricane plan. It does not mean you want a hurricane to happen. It means you want to be prepared if something is heading your way. And so one of the lessons that we've learned now, well into more than a decade of serving seniors in Brevard County, is that it really makes good sense to plan ahead for things you might encounter along the way. To try to make it seem a little less intimidating, we call it helping you get your ducks in a row. And a couple of things that we learn along that journey of things that you want to be aware of is two corollaries that we added to that. And forgive the barnyard animal expressions. The first thing that we learned about getting your ducks in a row is we said, be wise like an owl. Don't try this stuff on your own. Particularly in Brevard County, we're blessed to live in an environment where there is so much solid expert help. We often share the statistic 1 in 25 of us in Brevard County is over the age of 65, and 1 in 2 of us is over the age of 50. So we always say you either are a senior in Brevard, love and care for a senior, God willing, live another year or two, and you're going to be there too. So hopefully everything we talk about today is going to be important. And I think you're going to get a lot out of today's topic because so much of this ends up being new to us if we're not in the business of helping seniors ourselves. So the second corollary that I want to share with you before we jump into our conversation is really a theme that we've been on a lot too, which is called don't be an ostrich. And we all think of an ostrich as the one with the head in the sand and just putting off the problem or putting off something they don't want to deal with. And I promise you, particularly in today's conversation, you're going to get some insight into why planning ahead is really worthwhile on every single level. So I am so excited to introduce our guest today. She is Martin Hubble Platinum rated, let me say that, elder law attorney Katie Jackson-Stolz with the law office of Amy Van Fossen. Hello, Katie. How are you?
Good. Hi, Kerry. How are you?
I'm good. And, you know, we titled this program Probate, what it is, how and why to avoid it. And I want to start with this question because most of us, we were talking before we started the cameras, we say we always want to bring it from the perspective of somebody who's not really an expert in this. I qualify as not really an expert in this. So I think of the things that I grew up watching, a movie, and the attorney reads the will and such I bequeath my estate. And so we have this idea of how this works in like some Hollywood version of it, but it really does require us to think about this individually because I love something that Amy Van Fossen, who it's her law firm, the law firm of Amy Van Fossen. I've often heard her say, she said, Kerry, there's a plan. If you die without a will, there's a plan. The government has a plan, and they'll figure out what to do with what you leave behind. It just may not be a plan that is anything remotely like what you had in mind. And so I want to start with this concept of like, what is a will? And what is a probate? I just want, if it's okay with you, humor me, and let's start at the very basic building block.
Yeah, absolutely. So a will is a legal document that essentially you're going to say who you want to be in charge of your estate when you pass away. So in Florida, we call that a personal representative.
Okay.
So you're going to say, who do you want to be your personal representative? Right. In other states, they call it an executor or an executrix. So who do I want to handle things when I pass away if I leave a probate estate? And then where do I want my assets to go? To what people? That can be divided up amongst different individuals. You can say to this person, but if they pass away before me, then to this other person. You can leave your estate to charities. So the two important things are to name a personal representative, so name the person in charge, and then say where you want your assets to go.
Right. So I guess the point is then, so when we always think of that Hollywood scene where they all gather in the barrister's office with all the books behind them, and they say, now for the reading of the will is the paperwork that says this is the person's wishes of how they want their earthly property to be distributed. So if you don't have a will, there's still a plan. It's just not your plan, right?
Right. Yeah. So if you don't have a will, we look to the intestate law, which intestate means without a will. And every state has their own statutes that lays out how your assets will go if they're subject to probate, if you do not have a will. So every state is different. And if you don't have a will, then we're going to pull up those statutes and go line by line and see where your assets will go.
Okay. So now when we use that word probate, that is the point of going, tell me if I'm getting this close to right. That's the point where we're trying to now the legal process of saying, well, this is what we think the person wants, or this is the way the state wants it because they didn't tell us. And this is the process we go through to get these things distributed. Am I saying that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. So probate, not everyone's going to leave a probate estate. So not every person who passes away is going to have a probate. So a probate is when you have assets that are titled in your name only with no beneficiary on them. Okay. So for example, a house. If you have a property that's in your name only, you don't have a spouse or anyone else on your deed, that house is going to go to probate. Okay. So probate is the court-monitored process where you try to gather all the probate assets, you pay any valid creditors, and then you would distribute the assets according to the will. Or if there is no will, we're going to look to that intestate law we were just talking about.
So I keep hearing over and over, you would prefer to avoid probate, but and I part of this I know a little bit because I did had the opportunity of doing a great television show with a colleague of yours, attorney Tyler Runte, who did a program on trust. And what I do remember from that show, and by the way, viewer, all the shows that we're talking about, you can find on helpingseniorsof.org. You can find them on our Helping Seniors of Brevard YouTube channel, and you can find them on our Helping Seniors of Brevard Facebook page. And so what we often find is families will get onto a topic and then want to look through what's the different resources available. So we kind of call it the Helping Seniors Library. But I remember in having a conversation with attorney Tyler Runte about trust, and she was explaining one of the reasons that you would look to a trust is because you want to avoid probate. Now, since we're on a show about probate, let me ask the question, why do I want to avoid probate?
Absolutely. So you want to avoid probate because probate's the court-monitored process of getting these assets. So you can kind of think of probate assets are the ones that get stuck. So if we think of a house, for example, a way to avoid probate on a house is to get a trust, which I'm sure Tyler talked about in her segment. So you could put your house in a trust. If you don't, though, and your house needs to go through probate, it's going to be stuck. We're going to have to petition the court to get our personal representative appointed. We're going to have to say, Your Honor, Judge, there is a will or there wasn't will. Here's the people named in the will. Here's their addresses. A lot of paperwork. In Florida, you also have to run a creditor period for 3 months. So, for example, if you have a house, it's stuck in probate, we've got to wait at least 3 months, usually more like 4 or 5, before we can even get that house transferred. So that comes up a lot if it's hurricane season. And maybe your children, who you name as your personal representative and your beneficiaries, they live out of state. So now they've got to deal with this house, thinking about boarding up the windows, paying the mortgage, all these things while hurricane season's coming up. So that's why we say you want to avoid probate. One, it's a court-monitored process. So you've got to abide by different court requirements in the statutes and in the Florida Probate Code. But also it's just an extra kind of burden on the family or whoever's handling it. They can't get to the end. There's hoops and hurdles you got to jump through, and you can't just get to the end and distribute right away in most cases. So that's why we say you want to avoid probate because it's just kind of an added closing step your family or your loved one or whoever you name is going to have to do after you pass away, and it's not quick. So, if they're grieving and they kind of want to put it all together and close that chapter, they're not going to be able to if there's a probate case, because they're going to keep getting paperwork on it. And it has many steps to it, versus if you just put the house in the trust, for example, or do some other things to avoid probate.
Well, and that's why I maybe, excuse the phrase, leading the witness, as it were, but I've understood that there are many vehicles that you can look at that might help you avoid that process, which is, like, as you're explaining to me, is A, expensive, but also B, time consuming, and maybe has so much scrutiny that things could become a problem that otherwise wouldn't necessarily need to be a problem. And so I think, a thing that I'm familiar with is, like, I know a lot of times when you go to a bank and you open up a bank account and they say, do you want to have a paid on death beneficiary? And they say, because that would not then have to go through probate. Am I saying that right?
Yep, you are. So a POD, or a payable on death beneficiary. So the easiest way would be, for most cases, not all, but for many people, it's to have a trust. And you could either put that bank account in the name of your trust. That's the easiest way to avoid probate. So for me, I have the Katie Jackson-Stolz bank account. If I had a revocable trust, I would bring them a copy of my trust. I'd say, I want my account now to be in my trust. So now it's in the Katie Jackson-Stolz trust, or me and my husband's trust.
Right.
You've avoided probate. So just by having that asset titled in the trust, you avoid probate. Okay. Another way to avoid probate is with that POD, that payable on death beneficiary. You can make it your trust. Mm-hmm. So that's also an advisable thing to do. If you don't make it your trust, you could make it a human. And that's another way to avoid probate. And so for many individuals that works, but for others that might not be as good as a trust. So for example, I have minor children. So I can't make them the beneficiary, or I'm not going to make them the beneficiary on an account. They won't be POD 4-year-old and 2-year-old.
Right.
Because they're too young. But also in Florida, if you inherit more than, I think it's $15,000 and you're a minor, you have to go through guardianship court.
Wow.
So I would have it POD to my trust, where I could have my mother, for example, be the trustee to manage the money for my children until they reach whatever magic number age I say they're mature enough.
Well, so another thing that I'm getting from you as we're talking about this is, when you think about this the right way, you're able to exercise a lot more, I guess I would call it fine control, over making sure things are going to go the way you want. Because when you were just explaining that scenario, I was sitting there thinking, so often when we think of the reading of the will and all those kind of things, when you and the little bit I followed from Attorney Tyler Runte about the trust, and then hearing you talk a little bit about the probate, I'm kind of gathering, like, a real reason why you want to take the time and invest in learning how to do this is because it's going to save time, it's going to save money, but also it's going to give you a much finer control over to make sure that the things that you want to have happen are in fact going to happen.
Absolutely. And so you also can't, there's no one size fits all approach for each estate planning client or elder client. But if you have a trust involved, it does make it easier to plan for anything that could happen. Because your trust, if you just put POD at the bank to your sister, if anything happens to your sister, for example, she passes away before you, that is still a probate asset. Wow. Versus if you say POD my trust, your trust is a 20-page document with all kinds of information, directions of what to do if, for example, the sister passes away. So a time that I see probate a lot is when the second spouse passes away. So generally a husband and a wife, if they have their own accounts, wife has husband as POD, payable on death benny, husband has wife, first spouse dies, everything's fine because it just transfers. Say wife dies first, everything just transfers to husband. The kids will say everything was fine back when mom died first, but then when dad dies, he still had mom as his beneficiary on everything. She's already passed away, so those assets all go to probate. And the kids say, why? We didn't have to do it when mom died, and it's because you just had the POD of each other. If they had their trust, it would account for that.
That's a point that, not to take us down a rabbit hole on it, but it's one of the things that I remember through the process, because in helping seniors, we do radio, we do print columns in Senior Scene magazine, we do a lot of television shows. And oftentimes we're talking about this very topic about why it's so important to review. Even if you thought you had your documents together, it's important to review it, because I was thinking just about, if you had these done 20 years ago and maybe somebody got remarried or different things are going on, and when it's time to use it and somebody's going, blowing the dust off, you could be horrified to learn that what you thought you made sense 20 years ago probably doesn't in, today.
Absolutely. And so it's always good. We say your documents are kind of like a vehicle, and you want to service them every so often or periodically, just to make sure everything still is as you wish.
So, and a couple of areas that I want to tag up on here related to this is, so hopefully the argument is that you're getting that really, if you can avoid probate, you want to try to structure things in a way, and that has to do with your real estate, your investments, your bank accounts, and things like that. But there's another thing. In this day and age, we're always bombarded with those TV commercials that come on and say, oh, you can do this. It's easy. You can do your own estate planning online. It's going to be so cheap, and it's going to be so simple, and we'll guide you through every step. And yet the thing that I have been around elder law attorneys enough to have seen in the helping seniors world is that can be very, very dangerous, because it seems like it's a ticking time bomb. Like, you don't know that you made a mistake in whatever document you were trying to self-help yourself with until such time as it has to perform. And really, if you think about it, in the case of a probate, there is no do-over. You can't rewind the clock.
Absolutely. So we have multiple cases where somebody intended to create their own will.
Yeah.
And they unfortunately didn't follow the law for how to create a will. Yeah. And the will was not admitted to probate.
Wow.
Because it's not a valid will because of how they created it. And the assets did not did not match their wishes.
Wow.
So those always are sad, because you want to believe that person intended for it to go to this individual, but because they didn't create the will according to law, it went to other people. And I will say that another thing I see all the time when people do their own documents is they don't execute them right. So they don't. That's one of the biggest benefits of doing a will or your documents with an attorney's office, is that they know they're going to have two witnesses and a notary. They are going to make sure everything is signed in the right spot. I have seen people sign where the witness is supposed to sign. I've seen the notary just not check all the boxes that they need to check. So I have seen a lot with the execution. So actually the last page, just the signing page, being wrong. And so unfortunately, we always, if the client wants, we'll go to before the court and try, but it's very firm what the law is. And so if you don't meet the requirements, for example, you don't have witnesses, it's not a valid will, and there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, I was having so many thoughts as you were going through that. We live here on the Space Coast, so we understand rocket launches, and that's why they do a countdown, and they're so meticulous, right? They want to be sure at every second of the clock leading up to the launch, everything is going the right way, because once they punch that button, that rocket's going, and it's too late to change things. And I kind of got that sense as you were talking about this. It's the same thing with these documents, right? That's why you always want to check these out now, because once you hit the launch button, if it's not right, that rocket's going to explode and not do what they wanted it to do. Further than that, I wanted to ask you this question, because we see it all the time pop up. There's always a big news case about some famous celebrity passes away, and now wills are popping out of pillows and sofas and stuff like that. This is another reason why it probably makes sense to get this right the first time, so everybody is clear on how this is going to roll, right?
Absolutely. And so that we do have later wills and things like that. So it's even better if you do it on an attorney's office, because that attorney, our office and many of the other offices, they're going to scan it in. And they're going to have a copy of that original. Right. And they're also going to be able to attest to your capacity at the time of signing. Right. So that's something that if later someone was to say, no, dad didn't have capacity when he signed, use the previous will. The fact that you did it at a lawyer's office with two witnesses and a notary, excuse me, people who frequently are making sure someone has capacity, they're well versed in it. That's going to help you on that end as well. But I do see sometimes where they'll pull out different wills, and often when that happens, they're not done at a lawyer's office. They are DIY wills, and sometimes some of them are done according to the law, and some aren't. So the ones that aren't done are just thrown out, even if they're the earlier ones, and you imagine those might not have been the intent of the person who wrote the will. So
right back to this whole thing about, getting it right the first time, because there's no do-over. And related to that, I wanted to ask you about the about this, because another thing is there is a point about going to an elder law attorney specifically, because so often.
Excuse me, Kerry.
No, so often we will look, maybe we go to church someplace and there's this nice little lady who has a business card on the bulletin board. You say, oh, she could probably help me mine's not complicated. Or I have a great attorney. He helped me in my divorce case or something like that. Let me ask him to write the will. And he writes, well, but I have heard the stories, even that you guys have experienced in your law office, where that oftentimes doesn't work because the person doesn't have the up-to-date knowledge of what's going on in Florida law. So they might be very competent over here, but this is not that.
Absolutely. And also with wills, there's what's required, what's in the statute, what's the bare minimum you have to do, and then there's a best practice that's going to make it easier. So, for example, in Florida, you don't have to have a self-proofing affidavit at the end of your will. But we know, the ones that go through probate court, that if you just have this extra self-proving page, it makes it easier on everybody to get the ball rolling at the beginning. So, even if someone's not familiar with probate or with estate planning and they're looking at the statutes, that's great, but they're going to be hitting the bare minimum versus us practitioners that are doing it all day long. We know how to add those little extra layers so that it'll be as easy as possible on your family at the end of the day.
Well, that's the other half of it too, right? Is like I've heard Amy Van Fossen herself. Again, we're talking with attorney Katie Jackson-Stolz with the law office of Amy B. Van Fossen, and Amy herself has said, Kerry, most of the time people are dealing with these situations, a few times in their life. It's not a regular thing. It's a new big deal when something like this comes down. It's stressful. You're probably in mourning. There's all these things that are going on, and we try to manage that as best we can with an experience of one or two. You guys are working through 20, 30, 40 of these at any given moment easily. And so you really have also the background to know, what the court is looking for, how to make this as basically as smooth as possible. And those are some of the benefits I think that you get, which is why one of the corollaries to get your ducks in a row is we say, don't try this on your own. Get somebody who knows the lay of the land and can guide you. Because I guess the other thing is everybody's situation is unique to them. And I was thinking about, if you've ever filled out a form online and they give you like those little check boxes, so you got to choose one, and you're reading the first option, you're reading the second option, you're reading the third option. As you read to them, you go, well, it's someplace between B and C, and there's not a way for me to tell the computer that. But you guys, that's where you come in, because you know the nuances, and you can look at somebody's situation and then say, well, given this is how we need to position that.
Absolutely. So law can be really frustrating at times because you go to law school and you think it's going to be black and white and you're going to have the answers for everything, but it's really gray. So you will have cases that have a certain issue, and it's not in the statute, it's not in the probate code. So experience is where you gain a lot of value for your client. Being before a certain judge over and over and over, which way the judge kind of leans on certain issues. Right. So having that experience, and probate intersects with other areas like landlord-tenant, for example, foreclosure. And so there's not always an obvious answer in the law for every scenario because they're all different. So with experience and having high volume cases, you're better able to save your client time by saying, realistically, this is how this would play out.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so again, it's the benefit of experience. Again, talking with attorney Katie Jackson-Stolz with the law office of Amy B. Van Fossen. And one of the things that I really recommend, you guys are so generous with your time. You come out and take time from all the work that you guys have to do to help us educate the public on the helping senior side of it. But you also are very generous with your time in the public, because you guys will do a lot of absolutely free to the public kind of like seminars where you are really educating people on things that we may not even know are the road mines we would run into otherwise. And so if somebody wants to take a look at that, I assume they might go to the website or call the office. What would you recommend to somebody? Say, like, I hear you guys talking about probate. You're convincing me it's probably not the best road. I need to do something. What should I do next?
Absolutely. And I will say some of our probate clients that had to be a personal representative in their loved one's estate, those are the first people to say, sign me up for an estate plan, because I do not want my children or my loved ones to have to go through probate. I don't want to leave a probate estate. How do I do that? So if you're also interested in that, we have estate planning seminars at the office. So you could call the office at 321-345-5945 and just say, I'd like to attend an estate planning seminar. When's your next availability?
I think it's such important advice, because you lose nothing. And I was actually doing a radio show recently with Amy, and I was talking about this. I said, people should not be afraid of this, because I've been to them. And a lot of times we see things and we say, oh, it's like a timeshare sales thing. They're going to twist my arm until I do it. And what is beautiful is it's so low key and it's so educational that it is actually inspirational. You say, I really need to get this stuff done. So I want to encourage you to take advantage of that. Thank you, Katie Jackson-Stolz, for joining us today on this program, Probate, what it is, how to avoid it, and why. We'll see you next time on Helping Seniors TV.
I'm Joe Steckler. Thank you for joining our program today. I'd like to remind you that our senior information line is available to you at 321-473-7770. There you can get help and direction that could be helpful for your specific situation or circumstances. The work of helping seniors is very important, but we can't do it alone. That is why our sponsors here in Brevard County are so important. I'd like to thank our many area sponsors, businesses, and medical providers who support the mission of helping seniors that help us carry the cost of our media efforts. If you'd like to join us either as a business partner or simply donate as an individual, we welcome your call at 321-473-7770. You are always welcome to visit our website at www.helpingseniorsofbrevard.org. Thanks so much for your help. It does make a difference.